Let me tell you a secret they never wanted you to hear, a secret buried beneath the cracked boards of a farmhouse that once stood alone in the Texas cross timbers. Imagine the dawn of June 22, 1899, the wind scraping across the tall grass like 1,000 whispering knives. Inside, the air so still it felt as though the house itself had died. A neighbor, just a man doing his morning rounds, pushed open the door and stepped across the threshold, and in that instant, the world he thought he knew collapsed. The Yates children lay in their beds, faces pale and serene, as if sleep had carried them gently away. But it hadn't. What ended their lives wasn't a sickness, nor a stranger's hand. It was something more insidious. A force that seeped into Margaret Yates' mind, corroding her sanity in quiet increments. A voice she could not silence, an invisible contagion that bred in isolation and fed on the unspoken shame of a community too proud to admit it was powerless. They called it melancholy. They called it hysteria. But you and I know better. What haunted that house was older than any diagnosis. It was the perfect marriage of guilt and expectation, a psychological parasite that found purchase in the fragile chambers of her mind. If you stand in those fields today, you can still feel it. A hush that clings to the ruins like a film of regret. That's why you're here, isn't it? You're tired of the polished lies, the safe explanations that keep you docile. You came because you suspect something most men refuse to consider, that ordinary life is a theater, and behind its paper walls are forces you can never unsee once you catch a glimpse. That morning in 1899 was a doorway. A revelation in blood and silence. And if you listen carefully, you can almost hear what Margaret heard in those final nights, a promise that surrender was the only escape. This isn't just a story about a mother's madness. It's a cipher. A map that will lead you into the hidden architecture of control itself. Keep listening. Because the descent has only begun. They'll tell you it was the loneliness that broke her. The endless miles of prairie, the wind that never stopped moaning through the gaps in the boards, the burden of 5 small lives pressing down on her thin shoulders. But those are just the comfortable illusions we use to avoid the truth. Because if you look closer, if you're willing to pull back the curtain, you'll see that Margaret Yates didn't simply unravel on her own. She was a vessel, an unwitting conduit for an infection that spread invisibly through the cross timbers. It began long before she ever set foot on that farm. Before she even knew Thomas Yates' name. The seeds were sown in the way her parents measured her worth by how quickly she could secure a husband, the way the town measured a woman's virtue by how little she complained. In those days, a man's land was an empire, and his wife was the currency that purchased legitimacy. Margaret became part of the transaction, smiling in her borrowed wedding dress as the ink dried on a future she never truly chose. They praised her for her gentle spirit, her obedience. They never noticed how that praise hollowed her out. When she arrived in Cedar Creek, the other women eyed her with a mix of envy and suspicion. She was refined, educated, so they called her delicate, as if frailty were the inevitable cost of grace. It was easier to label her fragile than to wonder what might happen if any one of them were left alone too long with their own thoughts. Over time, the walls of her mind began to buckle. She learned to hide it. She learned to nod and thank them for their gossip disguised as concern. But no one asked why her hands shook when she tried to sew, or why she sometimes stood at the window for hours, watching the horizon as if expecting something to crawl over it. They assumed her sorrow was private, a woman's burden. And in that assumption, they left her undefended. I want you to remember this: what destroyed Margaret was not simply isolation. It was a system that fed on her compliance and called it virtue. A hidden structure of control so familiar, no one questioned its purpose. Until it was too late, you must understand, what happened in that house wasn't sudden. It was ritual. A slow, invisible rite of passage into madness. But madness is just the name they give to those who see what others refuse to. Margaret didn't snap. She awoke. Bit by bit, reality peeled back like scorched wallpaper, and beneath it, she saw something ancient. Something patient. It began with the ticking. That's what she called it. A sound in the walls that no one else could hear, like a clock winding down in reverse. At first, she thought it was the strain of sleepless nights and crying infants. But the ticking didn't stop when the children were quiet. In fact, it got louder. Then came the dreams. Not ordinary dreams, but the kind that leave residue on your skin when you wake up. Margaret began writing things down in a tattered Bible, passages that didn't exist, inked in a hand that didn't feel like hers. Lines like, "The wheat grows tallest where the blood has soaked the roots." The preacher said she was under spiritual attack. The doctor said it was the womb. Both were wrong. Because one night, as she sat awake while the others slept, she saw something moving in the corner of the room. Not a man. Not an animal. A shape. Tall, thin, flickering like heat rising off stone. It didn't speak, not with words. But Margaret understood. It had always been there, feeding, watching, waiting. She didn't tell Thomas. She didn't pray. She began to obey. Not out of fear, but out of recognition. She'd been raised to submit, first to her father, then to her husband, then to God. This was no different. This thing behind the veil. It demanded the same obedience. Only now, there were consequences for failing to listen. The children began to notice. Sarah asked why Mama whispered at night when no one was around. William began sleeping with a Bible under his pillow. Baby Samuel would scream if left alone in the room where the shape had appeared. Margaret told herself it was coincidence, the fatigue of a mother's mind. But deep down, something in her understood, her family was marked. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was sacrifice. The land had taken others before. It was hungry again. There's something they don't teach in textbooks about the American frontier. It wasn't built on grit and virtue, it was built on silence. On what people were willing to ignore in order to survive. You see, Cedar Creek wasn't a community. It was a mirror. And every soul in that town looked at Margaret Yates and saw a reflection of their own fear. Not of madness. But of exposure. Because if Margaret could unravel, so could any one of them. That's why they said nothing. Not when her eyes stopped blinking. Not when she stood barefoot in the fields before dawn, murmuring to the wind. Not when the children began to show up at neighbors' doors, hollow-eyed and trembling. They watched, and they waited, for someone else to act. And while they waited, the shape in Margaret's house grew stronger. It's a mistake to think of it as a ghost. Ghosts are echoes. This was a presence. Something woven into the very soil, older than the Yates family, older than Cedar Creek. It had been there long before settlers raised barns and built churches. The Comanche had a name for it, Dakota. The hunger that watches. But no one had listened to them either. Thomas was too proud to see it. A man who measured his worth in acres and yields, who believed emotion was weakness and hardship was honor. He didn't understand the difference between endurance and surrender. So when Margaret began locking herself in the pantry, scribbling on the walls in charcoal and blood, he dismissed it as a spell. She needed more laudanum, he said. More prayer. More chores to keep her distracted. What she really needed was someone to break the ritual. Someone to say no. But no one ever did. Instead, the pressure mounted. The sound of flies in places where there were no flies. The mirrors that refused to show her reflection. The baby's eyes following empty corners of the room. And the ticking. Always the ticking, faster now, like something winding up instead of down. Margaret began to believe there was a countdown. That each tick brought her closer to something final. Not death. No, death would have been a mercy. What was coming was transformation. She wasn't being broken. She was being rewritten. And the house was helping. You think you're safe because you live in an age of electricity and medicine. But the same machinery that consumed Margaret is still alive in your world, only now it wears a more sophisticated mask. It tells you that all suffering has a name, a diagnosis, a pill. That no darkness exists beyond the neat borders of science. But let me ask you this, if she was merely sick, why did the land itself react when she began to slip? Neighbors later said that in the final weeks, the Yates farm grew strange. The wheat refused to sprout in the eastern field. The well water tasted metallic, tinged with a bitterness no filter could remove. Birds stopped nesting in the cottonwoods. Dogs refused to cross the porch. Some called it superstition. Others whispered that Margaret had invited something unclean into her home. But even those who scoffed at curses would admit the place felt wrong. It was as if the house itself had decided the family was no longer welcome among the living. The air turned heavy, sour with a sweetness like overripe fruit. Doors stuck shut without reason. Lamps refused to stay lit, plunging the rooms into a darkness thick enough to choke on. And in that darkness, the shape came closer. Margaret stopped hiding it. She began speaking to it openly, as if Thomas and the children were no longer real. She would cradle baby Samuel and hum lullabies in a language no one recognized. Sometimes the older children would wake to find her standing over them, her hands hovering inches from their throats, her lips moving in frantic prayer. Thomas couldn't deny it anymore. But he also couldn't face the truth. That every mile he had plowed, every fence he had built, every harvest he had hauled to market had been in service of a lie, that hard work alone could protect a man from the unknown. He begged Margaret to see reason. He threatened her. He wept. None of it mattered. Because Margaret was past the point of return. She was no longer a woman fighting madness. She was a disciple of something older than civilization. And every night, the ticking in her skull grew louder, counting down to the moment when she would finally do what the shape demanded. And what it demanded was sacrifice. There are things a man can endure: hunger, loss, the slow decay of hope. But there is one thing no father is ever prepared to face: the knowledge that his children are no longer safe in their own mother's arms. In the last days of that bleak June, Thomas began sleeping in the barn, afraid to close his eyes beneath the same roof as Margaret. The neighbors would later pretend they hadn't noticed how he started drinking himself numb each night, just to dull the terror that grew in him like a tumor. But terror has a purpose. It is a messenger, a warning that the familiar has turned predatory. And in that farmhouse, the ordinary trappings of family life, the cradle, the kitchen table, the quilt on the marriage bed, became props in a theater of horror no one dared interrupt. At dusk, the children sat together on the floor, clutching each other as Margaret circled them, her feet tracing the same path over and over. She spoke softly, her voice threaded with something that wasn't quite human. Sometimes she would stop to press her palms to each child's forehead, as though measuring their readiness. Sarah told a neighbor later that Mama said they would be pure again soon, that the shape had promised to lift them out of their suffering. Even then, Thomas couldn't bring himself to act. He was a man trained to believe a husband's duty was to protect his family from the outside world, bandits, droughts, creditors. But how do you protect them from the darkness behind your wife's eyes? What tool, what law, what prayer do you use to stop a force that has no name? And still, the town did nothing. Because to interfere would be to acknowledge that civilization was a thin film stretched over a deeper, older wilderness. One where the mind itself could become corrupted. So they watched from a safe distance as Margaret prepared. On the final night, the children did not cry. Perhaps they sensed that resistance was pointless. Perhaps they were too exhausted to fear what was coming. In the flickering lamplight, Margaret smoothed their hair, kissed their cheeks, and told them they were chosen. When dawn broke, the house was silent. The shape had been fed. The ritual complete, the official story is simple: Margaret Yates suffered a breakdown. A mother driven mad by isolation, depression, and the weight of her own life. That's what the papers printed. That's what the coroner wrote. But those who stood in that house, those who felt the temperature drop as they crossed the threshold, knew better. The silence wasn't natural, It was too complete. The kind of silence that follows something, like smoke after a match is blown out. The children were found tucked into their beds, not a single wound upon them. Peaceful, as if sleeping, but cold. Very cold. Their lips blue, their hands clasped over their chests as though someone had staged them for an audience. Margaret was found in the hallway, collapsed against the wall, the laudanum bottle spilled beside her. Her pulse was faint, her breath shallow. She had written a single word on the wall in her own blood, unseen. Not sorry. Not a name. Not a plea. Just that one word, over and over again, in looping letters like a child learning to write. The sheriff called it insanity. The doctor said it was evidence of a psychotic break. But the preacher, old Pastor Griggs, he refused to enter the house at all. Said he felt a presence on the porch that told him, plainly, you are not welcome here. That's the detail no one ever printed. That the pastor of the town, the man who was supposed to banish evil with prayer, turned around and walked away. Margaret survived. But not really. Her body lingered, but her mind never returned. They committed her to a sanitarium outside Austin, where she spent the rest of her life staring at a blank wall, whispering to something that no one else could see. She never spoke the children's names again. Never asked about Thomas. Never explained why. And that house? They tried to sell it. No one would buy. It rotted slowly for 20 years until lightning struck it one dry summer and burned it to the ground. Some say it was divine justice. Others say the land had finally consumed what was left. But you and I, we know better. That house wasn't destroyed. It was released. Most men believe history is a ledger, names, dates, causes neatly written in black ink. But there is another record. One etched in the marrow of the land itself. You can feel it if you stand where the Yates house once smoldered, close your eyes, and let the wind press against your skin. There's a taste to it, bitter, metallic, ancient. The taste of an unfinished story. Because what happened in 1899 was not an isolated tragedy. It was a signal. A reminder that the wilderness never truly surrendered to civilization. That beneath every fence and church steeple, the old hunger still stirs, patient as ever. And those who glimpse it, even for a moment, are changed forever. Thomas Yates never spoke publicly about that morning. He buried his children in a row behind the north pasture, marked only with wooden crosses he carved by hand. No sermons. No eulogies. Just 5 small mounds of earth, and a man who would spend every remaining year trying to deny what he had seen. They say he died quietly in his sleep, but those who sat by his deathbed claimed he kept mumbling the same phrase over and over, "It's still watching." He was right. In the decades that followed, other families tried to settle the land around Cedar Creek. They built homes. Planted crops. Some stayed. Most left. They spoke of strange happenings, tools disappearing, livestock found dead with no wounds, children waking in the night screaming about a tall shadow in the corner. Each time, the stories were dismissed as frontier superstition. But when you collect the testimonies, piece them together like fragments of a broken mirror, they reveal a pattern. A shape that reappears wherever human ambition outpaces human understanding. A presence that feeds on loneliness, pride, and the belief that you alone can conquer the wilderness. That's why you need to hear this. Because this isn't just about the Yates family. It's about you. About every man who thinks he can build a fortress against the unknown. You can fence off your land. Lock your doors. Fill your life with distractions. But the truth waits in the quiet hours, when you are finally alone. And it will whisper the same question Margaret heard: what are you willing to surrender, to belong? You've been told your entire life that darkness is something to be conquered. That with enough faith, enough labor, enough progress, any wilderness can be tamed. But what if that's the lie? What if the wilderness has always been within you, patient, breeding in the hidden chambers of your mind? Margaret Yates was not the first to learn this. and she will not be the last. In the sanitarium where they confined her, the nurses recorded her mutterings, hoping to decode some fragment of sense. They catalogued her words in long, meticulous logs, labeling them delusions. But when you read those pages, you find something unsettling. Her ramblings weren't random. They were instructions. A ritual in pieces. Warnings. Promises. The shape is not a stranger, she whispered. It is the part of you that remembers the old hunger. Imagine that for a moment, that beneath your civilized habits and ambitions, there is something older, something indifferent to your laws and creeds. It doesn't care about your legacy. It doesn't care about your family name. It cares only that you remember what you truly are, fragile, temporary, easily undone. When the doctors failed to calm her, they increased the laudanum, dosing her into a stupor. But even then, she found ways to speak. She scratched words into the plaster with her fingernails. Words they later painted over, pretending they were never there. But paint does not erase meaning. And meaning, once glimpsed, is a contagion. One orderly quit after less than a month, claiming he dreamed every night of a woman in a stained dress standing at the foot of his bed. No matter how many times he woke, she was waiting. He said she never moved, never spoke, just watched. And when he finally fled the asylum, he left behind a single note: she showed me what waits. That is the knowledge no institution can contain. The knowledge that some truths are not meant to be solved, but survived. You came here to hear a story. What you've heard is a threshold. And if you step across it, you cannot step back. Be why now you're beginning to feel it, that tightening in your chest, the faint pulse of recognition. Because some part of you has always known that the greatest threat was never out there among the shadows. It was here, inside you, waiting for a moment of weakness. A moment of honesty. Margaret Yates was not the architect of her own destruction. She was the outcome of a system designed to break the inconveniently sensitive. A world that demanded silence and called it virtue. Her life was proof that when a culture worships endurance, it will sacrifice anything, wives, children, even its own sanity, to preserve its illusions of control. When the county sent officials to catalog the property, they found more than they expected. In the root cellar, they discovered a crude altar, stones arranged in a spiral, stained with something too dark to be wine. On the walls, symbols no one recognized, though older settlers claimed they resembled markings found on Comanche burial grounds. The sheriff ordered them scrubbed clean, burned the debris, and forbade further discussion. That's how you bury dangerous knowledge. Not with reason, but with fire and denial. But the fire didn't stop the dreams. For years after, men who worked the surrounding land reported visions of a woman standing among the blackened ruins, her hair unbound, her face blurred. Some claimed she whispered to them. Others said she simply watched, as if assessing their worth. Those who dared approach the place at night came back changed, restless, hollow-eyed, unable to name the fear that now haunted them. And what of Thomas Yates? He tried to start over in another county, remarried, even fathered more children. But those closest to him said he was never again truly present. That when the wind picked up at dusk, he would go still, as though straining to hear something no one else could. Perhaps the ticking Margaret spoke of had simply passed to him, like a contagion of the spirit. Listen carefully, this story is not a relic. It's a reminder. No matter how modern you pretend to be, you carry the same hunger, the same blindness, the same capacity for surrender. Comment below, twice, the words, "I am awake now," if you feel the stirring inside you. If you're ready to remember what the world has trained you to forget, now you have named it. That's the first act of power, naming what others deny. And as you read these words, as you feel that cold curiosity coiling in your gut, understand this, you're already part of the story. Because every story is a door, and once you step through, you are not the same man who began listening. The Yates farm is gone. The foundation sunk into the clay, the timbers rotted to splinters. But the place where it stood is still marked, if you know how to look. A circle where nothing will grow, not even weeds. Animals avoid it. Birds fall silent overhead. Some say it's a curse. Others believe it's simply where the membrane between this world and the next has worn thin. I tell you, it's neither. It's a threshold. The point where pretense fails and the deeper law reasserts itself. The law that says every civilization, every ambition, every righteous faith, will eventually feed the thing it cannot name. Because power has a price. Margaret Yates paid hers in sanity and blood. Thomas paid his in guilt. And the town of Cedar Creek paid in the corrosive knowledge that sometimes, survival demands complicity. When you study their letters, yes, some survived, you find the same refrain in different words: we thought we were building something permanent. They believed fences and rituals could domesticate the wilderness. But the wilderness was never outside their walls. It was their own need to belong to something larger than themselves. Even if that something was an old, hungry presence. That's why this story endures. Because every generation finds its own version of the shape. A movement. A creed. An empire. Each promising deliverance, each demanding obedience. Each ready to devour you the moment you surrender your vigilance. Do you feel it yet? That soft panic behind your ribs? That is the part of you that still remembers the old hunger. The part that knows no amount of progress can erase the truth of what you are: vulnerable, temporary, unfinished. And it is exactly in that unfinished place that the shape finds you. If you've stayed with me this far, you already sense it. This isn't merely a tale of a frontier tragedy. This is an anatomy lesson in how darkness takes hold. It doesn't arrive in a single, obvious stroke. It seeps in drop by drop, until the water you drink, the air you breathe, the thoughts you think all carry its invisible contagion. Ask yourself, how many men have stood at the edge of their own ruin and called it progress? How many have bartered away the last fragments of conscience just to avoid the humiliation of admitting they were lost? That was Thomas Yates's final sin. He knew Margaret was slipping. He knew the children were not safe. But he could not bear to admit that the life he'd built, the life he'd forced her into, was a prison she could no longer survive. So he let it happen. When the official inquest convened, neighbors swore under oath that they had no inkling of Margaret's decline. But their eyes betrayed them. You see, everyone in Cedar Creek had seen the signs: the vacant stares, the monotone voice, the children's silent pleas. Yet no one intervened. Because in a society obsessed with strength, confession is the ultimate taboo. Admitting weakness means risking exile. And exile was a fate worse than any haunting. That is the hidden doctrine of every settlement, every institution, every empire: conformity at any cost. Even if it means pretending not to hear the screams. Years later, when the land was parceled out to speculators, they came to survey the ruins. One man, he never gave his name, claimed he found a book among the scorched beams. Not a Bible, but something older, bound in dark, flaking leather. Its pages covered in markings that crawled across the paper like living things. He said he only looked at it for a moment before he felt something pressing against the inside of his skull. He dropped it and fled. No one else ever saw that book. But rumors persist. Some say it still surfaces now and then, passed hand to hand among those who seek the old knowledge. The kind of knowledge that makes you dangerous to the world as it is. And if you ever find it, you will finally understand what Margaret Yates became. They will tell you that such stories are exaggerations, superstitions clung to by ignorant people in an age of reason. But if you pay attention, you'll notice how quickly the voices grow brittle when you press for proof that the darkness isn't real. Because deep down, even the skeptics feel it, the soft, electric dread that comes when you stand too close to the place where the ordinary ends. And Cedar Creek was never an ordinary place again. Travelers reported strange echoes as they passed the old boundary fence, voices carried on the wind that didn't match any living tongue. Horses would balk and refuse to go further. Children, those born generations later, would come home pale and trembling after wandering too close to the site. They all described the same thing, a woman watching from the trees. Not approaching. Not retreating. Just watching. But the true corruption was subtler. You see, the Yates tragedy became a cautionary tale, told in whispers at quilting circles, murmured behind hymnals in the church. Mothers used it to frighten their daughters into obedience. This is what happens when a woman forgets her place. And in that way, Margaret's suffering was twisted into a moral lesson, one that absolved the community of its cowardice while reinforcing the very prison that destroyed her. That is the most effective kind of darkness, the one that hides behind righteousness. The one that demands sacrifice in the name of order. Some men came to profit from it. One traveling preacher pitched a tent revival on the ashes of the Yates house, claiming he could cleanse the land. Hundreds came to see him drive a stake into the earth, shouting that the devil himself had been exorcised. But 3 weeks later, his tent burned to the ground, and the preacher was never seen again. No one talked about it after that. Because the shape doesn't care what name you give it, devil, madness, failure. It feeds on your denial. It thrives when you mistake ceremony for redemption. So look around your life. The institutions you serve. The beliefs you inherited without question. How many are simply polished altars to the same old hunger? The kind that watches from the trees. Consider what it means that no photograph of Margaret Yates has survived. Not one. Though her children were captured in faded tintypes, though Thomas posed stiffly beside his harvest wagons, Margaret herself is only described. A face in recollection. A name etched on a ledger. As if the shape itself had claimed even the record of her existence, erasing her image so you'd never see how ordinary she looked, how much she resembled any woman you've passed on a street. This is how forbidden history survives, in the gaps, the absences, the details too uncomfortable to repeat aloud. The county archive holds boxes of affidavits, receipts, land grants, yet if you read them closely, you feel the gravity of what's missing. The omissions are the clue. They point to a deeper consensus no one dared write down, that the Yates tragedy was not an accident, not simply a woman's decline, but the final proof that something had taken root in their settlement, something they lacked the courage to confront. When the next generation grew up, they built their homes further from the site. But every so often, someone would venture close, some drifter, some surveyor, some curious boy with more bravado than sense, and they would come back altered. Not raving. Not violent. Just different. Quieter. Restless. Haunted by questions they couldn't phrase. That's why I'm telling you this. Because the shape thrives not on spectacle, but on infection, spreading through stories, glances, unfinished sentences. You're listening to this now because some part of you recognizes what the Yates family never understood, that nothing you build, no fence, no creed, no marriage, can fully keep it out if you refuse to see it. The real terror isn't that Margaret descended into madness. The real terror is that she may have seen something true, something that stripped away the illusions the rest of them died clinging to. And in the end, it didn't matter whether it was hallucination or revelation. It was enough to destroy everything she loved. Ask yourself, if it stood at the foot of your bed tonight, would you recognize it? Or would you pretend it was only a dream? You see, the shape doesn't need your belief to exist. It doesn't care if you dismiss it as folklore or pathology. It doesn't demand worship. All it requires is your silence. Your willingness to look away when someone begins to unravel. Your instinct to protect your own comfort instead of asking the question that could crack the world you've built: what if she wasn't crazy? What if she was right? Thomas Yates spent the rest of his life denying that question. Neighbors said he would still insist Margaret was just tired even after the funerals were over, even after the land was salted and abandoned. As though he believed if he could repeat it enough times, it might absolve him. But you can't absolve yourself of what you permit in your own house. And you can't erase a darkness that has learned your name. In the years after, other settlers reported a pattern of disappearances. A prospector who went to map the creek beds and never came back. A peddler who left his wagon at the edge of the property, as if he'd stepped away for a moment, and simply never returned. Their belongings were always intact, as though nothing had been stolen. Only the men were missing. Each time, the town came up with a convenient explanation. Bandits. Accidents. Wild animals. But never once did they consider the possibility that the same force that hollowed Margaret had simply found new hosts. That the shape had learned to wear different masks, slip past whatever vigilance remained. And if you listen to the old ranchers, the ones too stubborn to leave, some will tell you the truth. That when the moon is thin and the wind rises, you can hear voices coming across the fields. A woman's voice first, calling names. Then children, answering her. They don't sound afraid. They sound patient. As if time means nothing to them now. If you're still listening, it means some part of you is ready to see what others will never dare. To pull back the veil and look the thing in the eye. Because the shape doesn't only live in Texas. It lives anywhere men are certain they've tamed the dark. Imagine standing there alone at dusk, the ruins behind you, the cold wind combing the grass flat. In that moment, all the comforting explanations dissolve. There is no diagnosis, no moral failing, no folklore to hide behind. Only the simple fact that something watched Margaret Yates slip beneath the surface, and did nothing to save her. And here is the truth most men will never admit: you are not so different. You also hear the low, persistent hum in your mind when the night gets too quiet. You also feel the dread that your life is a house of straw, one bad season, one betrayal, 1 hour of weakness away from collapse. That is why stories like this survive. Because they are not cautionary tales about other people. They are mirrors. Those who catalogued the Yates tragedy wanted it to be a closed case. An aberration. But the final coroner's report, filed and forgotten in a county archive, contains a single sentence that stands apart from all the rote details of dates and inventories. In her final hours, subject exhibited lucidity inconsistent with previous observations. Lucidity. Consider what that means. That just before the end, Margaret stopped raving. She looked them in the eye. And she spoke with perfect calm. Some say she told them she was going home. Others claim she warned them that they, too, would hear the ticking. The most unsettling version is the one I believe, that she thanked them for coming, and smiled. As if a burden had been lifted. You see, the shape isn't only a predator. It's an inheritance. A kind of truth that frees you even as it destroys everything you once relied on. Look around at the men you admire, the ones who built empires, who commanded loyalty, who carved their names into history. How many of them do you think carried the same infection? How many traded their souls for the chance to stand apart? This is the part no one warns you about: once you glimpse the shape, it never fully releases you. And you will spend the rest of your life deciding whether to resist it, or become it. Somewhere, deep in the official archives, sits a weathered ledger recording every possession Margaret Yates left behind. 5 quilts. 2 Bibles. A child's wooden cradle. A locket with no photograph inside. And a bundle of letters, bound with coarse twine, so stained and brittle that most were deemed unreadable. But a few sentences survived. And they are more dangerous than any accusation or confession. Because they prove she knew exactly what was happening. One line, scrawled in a trembling hand, reads, "There is something here that eats the hearts of women. Not disease. Not mere melancholy. Something. If you're wise, you'll pause and think about that. Because every age finds its own way to rename the darkness, to soften it, to make it sound clinical, or noble, or simply unlucky. But the truth is that the darkness remains exactly the same. It does not evolve. It waits. And when a man refuses to name it, he becomes its instrument. Thomas Yates became just such a man. In the decades after, he told and retold a version of events that absolved him. He claimed Margaret was frail from childhood. That no one could have foreseen her decline. That her end was an accident of isolation and overwork. But some nights, when the whiskey had loosened his tongue, he confessed to something else. That on the last morning, before the neighbors discovered the children, he'd woken to find Margaret standing over him. Her hair unbound, her nightdress streaked with something he couldn't name. And she whispered, so close he could feel her breath in his ear, "We are all going together." He said he never forgot the way she looked at him. Not with hatred, but pity. And perhaps that was the greatest terror. To realize that the person you failed to save did not blame you, because she had already glimpsed how small and temporary you were. If you've listened this far, you are not like other men. You are willing to stand in the cold wind and feel your own fragility. And that is the first step toward real power, to look into the dark and see your reflection. Let me tell you what most men will never hear, because most men will never be still long enough to listen. There is a point beyond grief. Beyond madness. Beyond survival. A point where the soul becomes so threadbare that something else slips in to wear it like a coat. It doesn't happen with a scream. It happens with a whisper. A small surrender. A quiet yes spoken to the void when no one is listening. That's what happened to Margaret Yates. She didn't break all at once. She invited the dark in, because it offered what no one else had, recognition. And here's the part they scrub from every textbook, every history lesson: the shape that consumed her wasn't foreign. It wasn't evil in the way children are taught to fear. It was familiar. Intimate. It wore the same voice she heard in her mind every night. It offered clarity. And in a world that demanded her silence, clarity felt like salvation. We want to believe monsters announce themselves. That they growl, claw, leave trails of blood. But the most dangerous ones? They listen. They wait. And then they agree with you, when you whisper to yourself at 3 a.m. that maybe you're not enough. Maybe you never were. That's the threshold. That's where the shape steps in. And if you think this is about one woman in 1899, you're still living in the shallow end. Because Margaret's story is just one name in a long line. The shape appears wherever there are expectations no human can meet. Wherever men are praised for stoicism, and women are punished for breaking. Wherever the truth must be buried to protect the illusion of order. Ask yourself, what masks have you worn to avoid your own reckoning? What comforts have you clung to just so you wouldn't have to ask, what's really guiding me? The shape doesn't hide in the shadows. It hides in your compromises. In your obedience. In the roles you accept without question. But once you see it, once you've named it, it can never fully reclaim you. That is why you're still here. Because some part of you knows, it's not Margaret Yates who's trapped. It's the world that silenced her. Now, if you want to understand the final cruelty of this tale, you have to look past the tragedy itself. You have to see how it was used, transformed from horror into leverage. Because when the inquest closed and the land was parceled to speculators, the story became currency. Church elders invoked Margaret's name to frighten young brides into submission. Local politicians used her failure of virtue to argue that women should never own property outright. Traveling lecturers, men who had never set foot in Cedar Creek, charged admission to retell her downfall as proof of the feminine weakness they claimed to cure. In other words, her annihilation became an asset. This is how institutions maintain control. They do not simply erase inconvenient truths, they weaponize them, fashioning cautionary tales to keep everyone in line. And every time you flinch from naming the shape in your own life, you feed it exactly what it wants, your complicity. Consider this: there are letters, rarely quoted, where Thomas himself admitted that, in the final weeks, Margaret spoke of a light behind the dark. That she believed, beyond the terror, something waited that was not cruel but honest. A force that stripped away all illusions. She called it the inheritance. And perhaps she was right. Perhaps that inheritance is not damnation, but the knowledge that no law, no marriage, no scripture can truly contain the raw enormity of what we are. You are listening to this because some part of you suspects the same thing. That the border between sanity and revelation is far thinner than you were taught. That the shape Margaret named lives in every generation. That it stands in the quiet spaces, waiting for a moment of weakness, or a moment of perfect clarity. If you hear nothing else, hear this: you are not safe simply because you pretend the darkness isn't real. You are only safe when you can meet it without flinching. Most men will never attempt it. But you are not most men. If you have the courage, prove it. Declare yourself awake. What no one understood, not Thomas, not the doctor, not the ministers who buried the children with trembling hands, was that Margaret Yates did not lose her mind. She shed it. Piece by piece. Like dead bark from a tree that has grown too large for its skin. And what emerged wasn't insanity. It was clarity. She saw the structure for what it was, not a family, not a farm, not a faith, but a machine. One built to grind women into obedience and men into silence. She saw the architecture of the frontier wasn't forged to build freedom, but to bury failure under miles of dust and expectation. And when she finally spoke in her last hours, her words weren't confused. They were precise. Witnesses reported her saying, "They kept telling me I was broken, but it was the world that was shattered, and I was just the first one to feel the cracks." Those words were left out of the official transcript. Because truth, when it's raw and undiluted, has always been the greatest threat to power. You see, history is not a record. It's a weapon. And those who write it carve it to serve the lie that keeps the machine running. The lie that suffering is natural. That collapse is personal. That madness has no roots in culture. But if you trace Margaret's descent backwards, what do you find? A woman expected to endure isolation, exhaustion, emotional starvation, and told to call it grace. A community that saw her withering and called it duty. A husband who ignored the storm until it crashed through his roof and called it tragedy. The shape did not invent that suffering. It only used what was already there. It held up a mirror, and dared her to look. Now, I'm holding up that same mirror for you. What do you see? A man whose silence protects his comfort. Or a man who finally realizes, comfort was the real curse all along. The shape still waits in the places no one wants to go. The forgotten towns. The locked archives. The dark corners of your own beliefs. If you want to defeat it, you must first walk willingly into its domain. And when you come out the other side, if you come out, you will no longer be the same. Picture the old Yates homestead as it stood the year after the tragedy, weather-beaten boards sagging in the wind, the windows boarded up, the well capped with a slab of limestone no one dared to disturb. Local boys dared each other to run up and touch the front door, convinced that if you listened closely, you could hear the cries of children echoing beneath the floorboards. But the bravest never spoke about what they really felt when they crossed that threshold. Not fear. Not guilt. But a strange, magnetic pull, an almost tender curiosity. Because the shape doesn't merely horrify. It invites. It calls to the part of you that wants to see what's hidden, no matter the price. That's why you're still here, listening. Because you've always felt the same pull, haven't you? You've known there is something beyond the neat borders of your life, something older, colder, more honest. You've sensed that everything you were taught to admire, discipline, sacrifice, duty, can curdle into a poison when no one questions its purpose. And the shape thrives precisely because so few have the stomach to look it in the eye. They say Margaret's final moments were calm, but that's not quite true. The neighbor who found her said her lips were moving, whispering the same phrase again and again. She leaned closer, trying to hear, and realized it wasn't English. It was a language she'd never heard before, dry as old parchment, rhythmic as a lullaby. The old folks later called it delirium. But some of the children who heard it, they began to dream in that same cadence. To this day, families from that region pass down stories of children who wake in the dark, chanting syllables no one can translate. That is what it means to encounter the shape. You don't simply witness it. You inherit it. You carry it with you. And perhaps that's why men spend their lives in denial. Because they know, if they dared to open the door all the way, they'd never be able to close it again. Ask yourself, if you stood in that doorway tonight, would you step inside? Or would you cling to the lie that you're safer in ignorance? The final inventory of the Yates property was signed in the spring of 1900 by a county clerk who noted, almost as an afterthought, that the house was to be burned rather than sold. No official reason was given. But the townspeople knew why. Too many had gone in and come out altered. One man, a cattle broker, spent a single afternoon there inspecting the barn. 2 weeks later, he left his family in the night and was never seen again. A farmhand who helped remove the children's belongings was found days later wandering the prairie barefoot, muttering that the walls were still breathing. You see, the shape doesn't require your belief. It only requires your proximity. Once you stand close enough, something shifts in you. A seam splits. A hidden chamber unlocks. And everything you thought was solid begins to feel like a set of borrowed convictions. Most men never get that close. They inherit second-hand versions of the shape, smoothed over by gossip and folklore. But you, because you're still listening, are already nearer to it than you realize. And maybe that's why your pulse is elevated now. Because some part of you suspects that if you pressed your palm to that old limestone well, you'd feel warmth. That even after a century, the shape is still down there, patient, unhurried, calling. It isn't the fear that breaks a man. It's the knowledge that part of him wants to answer. This is the inheritance Margaret spoke of in her final days. Not a curse. Not a disease. But a perspective that annihilates all illusions of safety and control. Once you glimpse it, you can never again pretend your life is simply yours. You see the invisible architecture, how your thoughts have been shaped, your choices steered, your conscience manipulated by forces too old to name. That's why they burned the house. Not because it was haunted, but because it proved how thin the veneer of civilization really is. If you want to become the kind of man who commands his destiny, you must be willing to sift through that ash, to touch what others fled. Because in that final reckoning, you will discover the only truth that matters: the shape isn't just real. It's waiting for you. They say that time erases all things. But time is merely a polite disguise for forgetting, and forgetting is a luxury reserved for those who never look too closely. In the decades after the fire, Cedar Creek tried to pretend the Yates homestead had never existed. New settlers built homes farther away from the blackened field. Children were warned not to speak of the family in earshot of their elders. The county removed the property from official maps. But if you walked those plains at dusk, when the last light bled into the grass, you could still find the boundary stones. Weathered granite markers protruding from the soil like broken teeth, an outline of a life reduced to rumor. And if you were brave, or foolish, enough to stand there in silence, you would feel it, that subtle pressure behind the eyes, that crawling awareness in your gut. A presence, measuring you. Because the shape didn't die with Margaret. It simply receded, waiting for the next fracture it could slip through. This is the secret the powerful have always known, that darkness is not an external force to be defeated. It is an internal contagion, one they have learned to harness. You see it in every empire that rises on the backs of the broken. In every institution that demands obedience over understanding. In every generation that repeats the same mistakes, because truth is too costly to confront. If you doubt it, look around you. How many men do you know who are truly free? How many have dared to peel back the layers of their own inheritance, to name the shape that waits beneath their practiced smiles? This story isn't merely about Margaret Yates. It is about you. About the hidden bargains you've made to avoid your own descent. About the ways you have chosen comfort over awakening. And here is the paradox: the longer you deny the shape, the more power it has over you. But when you face it, unflinching, you discover something most will never taste, a sovereignty so absolute it frightens even the darkness. That is why you have stayed with me this far. Because you suspect the truth is not a threat. It is an invitation. To become something no system can contain, before we cross the final threshold together, you need to understand one last thing. The shape is not unique to Texas. Not bound by place or time. It is as old as civilization itself, older than any church, older than any flag. It is the silent architect of every system that thrives on obedience and fear. Some call it despair. Some call it possession. But I call it recognition, because it forces you to see the hidden architecture beneath your life. Margaret Yates did not die as the first to see it, and she was far from the last. There are stories, never printed in polite newspapers, of other families along the cross timbers who succumbed to the same invisible collapse. A woman in 1919 who drowned her 3 children in a horse trough, claiming she was commanded by the whispering dust. A young husband in 1934 who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a journal describing a presence in the wheat that watched him work. A teenage girl in 1951 who set fire to her parents' home after scribbling hundreds of pages that began with the same words, "I see it now." Always the same pattern. Isolation. Pressure. The slow erosion of certainty. And then the inevitable surrender to something older and colder than any human law. This is what no historian will tell you, the shape is not a single entity. It is a system. A template. A dark blueprint encoded in the way we are taught to survive. To inherit it is not to be cursed. It is to be offered a choice, remain a pawn in a game you never designed, or tear away the illusion and claim the only freedom that matters. Most will never make that choice. They will die with their illusions intact, never realizing they were born into a story written to keep them small. But you, because you have stayed here, because you have listened without flinching, you already feel the old patterns dissolving. The next step is yours alone. Step across the line. Become more than you were told you could be. And in that moment, you will understand why some men never look back. And now, we have come to the last door. The place where every story converges into a single, undeniable truth. This tale, Margaret's tale, is not just a cautionary account of a woman's descent into darkness. It is a revelation of how easily any life can be hollowed out by unseen hands. The shape thrives because it does not announce itself as your enemy. It comes as your obligation. Your tradition. Your inheritance. It comes as the voice that whispers, "This is simply how life is. Accept it." But tonight, you stand on the threshold of that old farmhouse in your own mind. You can feel the splintered boards under your boots. Smell the scorched timbers and the brittle traces of lie. You can almost hear the hush that settles when the shape becomes aware that you are watching it back. Because that is the secret no institution, no preacher, no historian wants you to discover. When you see it without fear, it loses the power to dictate your destiny. Yes, it may watch you. Yes, it may whisper. But the moment you refuse to shrink from it, you reclaim something most men never touch, the absolute ownership of your own soul. Understand this, you will never again be able to pretend you are merely an observer. You have listened too long, descended too far. The inheritance has already begun to unfurl inside you. You may feel it as a chill along your spine, or a clarity that sharpens your perception like a blade. Do not run from it. Do not apologize for it. Because this is what separates the awake from the herd, the willingness to stand alone in the ruins of certainty and build something real from the ashes. So if you hear the shape calling, know that it is not a summons to madness. It is an invitation to sovereignty. And when you walk back into the daylight, changed, branded by the truth you dared to face, remember that the world will try to convince you to forget. To pretend this was just a story. But you will know better. Because you have walked the blackened floor. You have heard the whispers beneath the cross timbers. And you will never again be the same. Welcome to the inheritance. You are no longer asleep.